The page was marked not with tears, but with the cold, exact prices of tallow candles bought with meagre copper pennies. Maren Vance did not cry over the damp, subterranean vaults of the northern keep. Tears contained salt and water froze quickly on the unheated granite floor. Instead, she dipped a cracked quill into a shallow glass well, keeping her wrist strictly elevated so the tremor in her arm would not smudge the heavy royal parchment. The sub-basement archives smelled of ancient paper rot, dried beeswax, and biting winter draught. The stone walls wept with condensation that froze into slick, black ice before it could reach the baseboards. It was the first day of the winter frost, though down here in the dark, the shifting seasons were measured entirely by the rigidity of the ink. Today, the black liquid had crystallized at the edges of the glass, forming a brittle crust that resisted the metal nib. Maren set the quill down on the scarred wooden desk. She unbuttoned the top inch of her threadbare grey collar, pressing the small glass inkwell directly against the pale, sensitive skin of her neck. Her fingers were mottled purple, the knuckles stiff and aching, lacking the circulation required to bend properly around a pen. The biting cold of the glass against her pulse was sharp, pulling a slow, measured breath from her lungs. She held it there for 30 seconds, counting quietly in the dark. The pulse of her own life served only to thaw the tools of her labor. When the liquid flowed again, she pulled her black leather logbook closer. It was a cheap, battered thing, bound with rough thread, resting incongruously beside the massive, velvet-bound registers of the sovereign's imports. She opened to the current date. Her handwriting remained impeccable, tight, upright, and utterly devoid of hesitation. Item: Sovereign Northern Imports, 400 yards of heavy wool, dyed indigo. Item: Unheated archive condition, estimated temperature 28 degrees. Item: Daily firewood ration denied. She did not underline the denial. She did not drag the pen to indicate frustration or despair. The young Omega treated the steady progression of her own hypothermia as nothing more than an administrative variable, a factual line item to be recorded alongside the heavy silks and imported velvets destined for the upper floors. The keep's domestic staff had withheld her wood for 3 consecutive days, ignoring her written requests. The system was functioning exactly as the hierarchy intended. Silence was a kind of armor, thinner than most but lighter to carry. Maren understood that anger required calories she did not possess, and resentment was a luxury afforded only to the fed. She focused on the scratch of the metal nib against the rough paper. The friction produced a microscopic warmth. She catalogued 12 bolts of heavy damask, noting a discrepancy in the dye lot. The imported wool was meant for the royal guest chambers. It was thick, heavy with natural oils, designed to trap heat against the skin. She was required to inspect the edges for moths, running her cracked thumbs over the luxurious weave before folding it back into the cedar-lined crates. The contrast between the wealth in her hands and the frost in her lungs was stark, but entirely irrelevant to her duties. Her job was to record reality, not to alter it. Only when a heavy set of footsteps echoed down the stone corridor did her hand stall. The gait was deliberate, punctuated by the sharp click of a silver-tipped cane against the freezing granite. Not a servant, a master of the estate. Maren capped the inkwell immediately. She slid the black leather logbook beneath a stack of blank requisition forms, smoothing her faded apron over her lap as the iron-banded door swung inward. Alistair Thorne did not knock before stepping into the archive's central sorting bay. The head seneschal wore a tailored wool coat trimmed with deep crimson fox fur, the heavy collar pressed high up against his jaw. He exuded an aura of performative politeness, the kind of polished civility that masked systemic cruelty and a deep reliance on empty status. The temperature in the room seemed to drop further, purely from the coldness of his assessment. He ran a gloved finger along the edge of a sorting table, checking for dust in a room that saw no sunlight. "You are falling behind on the quarterly grain audits, Maren," Alistair said, his voice a smooth, flat drawl that bounced off the curved stone ceiling. Maren stood immediately, ignoring the sharp pain in her frozen knees, keeping her gaze angled respectfully toward the floor. "The grain audits require the southern agricultural ledgers, sir. They have not yet been sent down from the upper war room." Alistair ignored her logical answer. His attention had drifted from the organized stacks of textiles to the corner of her desk, settling on a small, dented iron bucket resting near the leg of her stool. It was a personal charcoal heater, barely the size of a tea kettle. Inside, 3 small embers glowed faintly, emitting a negligible ring of warmth. She had purchased the charcoal herself, trading her weekly meat ration to a stable boy for the scraps, just to keep her fingers functional. "What is this unauthorized debris?" Alistair asked, extending his polished leather boot toward the bucket. "A personal brazier head seneschal," Maren answered, her tone completely neutral. Without a change in expression, Alistair drove the toe of his boot into the side of the iron bucket. The metal scraped harshly against the granite. The bucket tipped, rolling onto its side. The 3 small embers spilled out onto the damp stone floor, hissing violently as they met the freezing moisture. A thin curl of acrid grey smoke rose into the drafty air, carrying the last vestige of heat away with it. Within seconds, the faint orange glow died into useless grey ash. Maren did not flinch. She kept her eyes locked entirely on the polished leather of his boots. She counted the seconds of silence in her head. 1, 2, 3. "An Omega does not require a hearth-fire to file ledgers," Alistair stated, adjusting the silver cuff of his sleeve with deliberate slowness. "This is a royal archive, not a vagrant's camp. The smoke damages the parchment and offends the sensibilities of the upper floors. If you find the climate unsuitable, perhaps you should apply for labor in the outer ditches. I hear the physical exertion keeps the blood running." "I understand, sir," she answered softly. "I will have the courtyard guards confiscate this hazard," he added, motioning toward the spilled bucket. "You are to finish the textile registry by nightfall. The sovereign expects absolute efficiency in his administration. See that you do not disappoint the king with your inherent fragility." Alistair turned on his heel, his heavy fur coat sweeping the dead ash across the floor as he walked out. The rhythmic tapping of his cane faded back into the dark corridor, leaving the biting winter silence behind. Maren did not bend to pick up the bucket. She did not wrap her arms around herself to conserve heat, nor did she curse his name to the empty room. Instead, she reached beneath the blank requisition forms and pulled her black leather logbook back into the dim candlelight. She warmed the inkwell against her neck one more time, enduring the sharp bite of the cold glass until the ink turned fluid. Then she picked up her pen. Item: personal charcoal heater, confiscated and destroyed by head seneschal Thorn. Time: 14th hour, 10 minutes. Quote, "An Omega does not require a hearth fire to file ledgers." Quote, "If you find the climate unsuitable, perhaps you should apply for labor in the outer ditches." She transcribed his cruel words with the same flawless, upright script she used to record the indigo wool. It was not an act of rebellion nor a plea for pity. It was an act of absolute clinical preservation. Alistair believed his commands evaporated into the freezing air the moment he spoke them, protected by his high status and her invisible rank. He was wrong. Ink dried faster than tears in the bitter northern wind, binding his arrogance permanently to the page. Maren closed the black leather cover, sliding it back into the shadows, and returned her numb hands to the royal ledgers. The air in the subterranean vaults rarely moved, but today it was fractured by the heavy, hurried footsteps of a senior keeper. Keith Sterling did not walk into the archives. He descended upon them like a man fleeing a collapsing bridge. His woolen cloak smelled of ozone and fresh winter snow, a sharp contrast to the stagnant scent of decaying parchment in Maren's world. He carried a brass lantern that swung wildly, casting erratic shadows against the weeping stone walls. The quartermaster's tallies, Keith demanded, stopping just short of Maren's small wooden desk. His breath plumed in the freezing air, creating a white cloud that briefly obscured his face. The western border outposts are reporting a deficit in winter grain, and the council requires the regional disbursement ledgers immediately. Maren did not flinch. She simply set down her quill, carefully wiping the excess ink onto the edge of a cracked inkwell so as not to waste a single drop. She was already surrounded by towering stacks of slate tablets and vellum scrolls, her workspace organized with a clinical, unyielding precision. Beneath her freezing fingertips lay her own illicit record, open to the current date. She had just finished recording the exact temperature of the room and the denial of her morning tea ration by Nellie Gray. "The western tallies are in the third row, shelf 4, Maren answered, her voice a quiet, measured stream. She stood up, her joints popping slightly in the brutal cold. "I will retrieve them for you. It will take a moment to unseal the particular chest, as the locks have frozen over." "There are no moments left," Keith said, his tone clipped. He was a practical man, not inherently cruel, but his realism left no room for the slow, methodical pace of an unranked clerk. He pushed past her, heading directly for the third row without waiting for a key. He grabbed a massive stack of bound records, hauling them back to the desk and dumping them unceremoniously onto the wooden surface. The impact rattled the inkwell, sending a tiny spray of black droplets across the bare stone. Maren moved to intercept his hands, her posture steady, despite the physical ache in her shoulders. "Please, sir, allow me to verify the dates on those bindings." The quarterly shifts overlap with the previous year's winter grain. The Alpha King is waiting, and Alistair is already searching for someone to blame for the deficit. Keith interrupted, not looking at her. He began scooping up the entire pile of documents in one hurried, chaotic motion. "I will sort them in the war room. I do not have the luxury of double-checking your indexing today. The Council does not wait for Omegas to verify their alphabet." "Wait," Maren said, her voice dropping an octave, catching a sudden flaw in the architecture of his pile. "You have mixed the private dockets with the official." Keith did not listen. He swept his thick arms around the precarious stack of scrolls and ledgers, dragging them tightly against his chest. In his frantic haste, his heavy woolen sleeve snagged the edge of Maren's black leather logbook, pulling it directly into the center of the royal documents. The black leather cover blended briefly into the shadows of the older, darker bindings. Before Maren could reach across the wide table to extract it, Keith turned on his heel. He marched back toward the spiraling stone stairs, his heavy boots echoing sharply against the granite, taking the lantern light with him. Maren stood frozen beside the empty desk. The small space where her personal record had rested was now just a rectangle of bare, splintered wood. She took a single step toward the staircase, her cracked knuckles tightening against the coarse linen of her skirt. She could not follow him. To ascend into the upper corridors during an active council session without a summons was a strict violation of hierarchical law, an offense punishable by immediate confinement in the lower cells. She let her hand fall back to her side. The logbook was gone. She had spent 3 years documenting every withheld meal, every confiscated piece of charcoal, every degree of frostbite she endured in the dark. That worn chronicle was the only evidence she possessed that she was still a person, not simply a machine built to tally someone else's wealth. Now, it was traveling upward into the highest echelons of the keep, carried by a man who had not even noticed its weight. She stared at the empty stone archway, listening to the faint drip of condensation from the ceiling. The war room was a sanctuary of calculated silence, built far above the damp misery of the archives. The high arched windows were sealed tight against the northern wind, letting in only a muted, grey winter light that fell across a massive mahogany table. The air smelled of beeswax, cedarwood, and the faint metallic tang of cold iron. Heat radiated steadily from a massive stone hearth, keeping the chamber at a comfortable, luxurious warmth. Darius Vaughan stood at the head of the table. He occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. His broad shoulders were squared, under a dark, tailored tunic, his posture perfectly still, as the council members slowly filed out of the chamber. The emergency meeting regarding the grain deficit had yielded nothing but excuses and deflected blame from his senior staff, leaving a sour tension lingering in the room. Only the documents remained, a chaotic mound of vellum scrolls, wax-sealed treaties, and heavy regional ledgers lay scattered across the polished wood, abandoned by Keith during the frantic briefing. Darius did not call for a servant to clear the table. He preferred the unvarnished truth of raw numbers over the polished lies of his senescals. He reached out with a scarred, steady hand, intending to review the quartermaster's tallies himself. He sifted through the gilded borders of the official decrees, pushing aside the thick, cream-colored parchment bearing the royal crest. Then, his fingers brushed against something entirely foreign. The texture was wrong. It was not the smooth, treated calfskin used for the sovereign's records, nor the heavy, chalky slate of the tax collectors. It was coarse, cheap pigskin, brittle with age and extreme cold. Darius frowned slightly, pulling the object from beneath a stack of grain audits. It was a small, unassuming book. The binding was held together by rough grey thread, hand-stitched with a meticulous but desperate precision. The cover bore no official seal, no gilded title, no crest of the sovereign's estate. It looked like an object that belonged in the mud of the outer villages, not resting on the mahogany table of the Alpha King. He weighed the book in his broad palm. It was surprisingly light, yet dense with pages. The physical friction of the unpolished leather against his skin felt like a violation of the room's pristine geometry. It did not belong here. It was a crack in the flawless presentation of his court, a jagged edge left behind by someone entirely invisible to the upper ranks. Darius traced the uneven line of grey thread along the spine. His senses, usually dominated by the scent of his own high-ranking officers and the rich cedar of the room, caught the faintest olfactory cue clinging to the cover. It smelled of old dust, freezing stone, and the sharp metallic tang of dried blood. It was the scent of the deep subterranean vaults, a scent he recognized instantly. Darius leaned closer, the ambient light catching the sharp, uncompromising angles of his jaw. He read the first sentence, and then the next. The absolute stillness of his posture broke. His breathing, usually a slow and measured rhythm, halted completely in his chest. He stared at the page, the words pressing into his mind with the cold, undeniable weight of a winter storm. This was not an audit of the sovereign's wealth. It was a factual, agonizing record of human endurance, and the name written in the margins confirmed that it was happening inside his own walls. Across the war room, Keith Sterling stood by the iron-bound doors, waiting with practical patience for the king to finish reviewing what they both had assumed was a standard quarterly audit. But the Alpha King's gaze remained locked on the black leather logbook, tracing the worn black leather pages. The handwriting before him was not the sprawling scrawl of a frightened servant. It was architectural, meticulous. Every letter was pressed into the thin paper with unyielding precision, utilizing a grey ink that had dried flat and pale. October 12th, the entry read, morning rations denied by order of the kitchen staff. Firewood allowance reduced to 0 for the lower vaults. Temperature at dawn, below freezing. Work completed. 40 ledgers transcribed. Darius stared at the words. There were no emotional outcries, no tears staining the cheap paper. Maren Vance had simply recorded her starvation and systemic neglect, as if it were a matter of administrative routine, utilizing clinical detachment as a quiet armor against the humiliation. He turned the leaf, the dry parchment rasping loudly in the quiet room. The next entry was shorter, dated 3 days later, October 15th, required to purchase tallow candles to complete the evening transcription of the Sovereign Treasury records. Cost of 3 candles, 4 copper pennies. Personal funds remaining, 11 coppers. A sudden, sharp tightness seized the air in Darius's lungs. He traced the faded grey ink with a slow, deliberate movement, his finger hovering over the exact price she had documented. 4 copper pennies. The Alpha King of the Northern Territories, a sovereign who commanded vast reserves of gold, had a clerk buying her own light in the dark because his senescals refused to provide it. His hand developed a slight involuntary tremor. It was not a shake of weakness, but of violent, suppressed kinetic energy. Keith shifted his weight by the door, the subtle scuff of his leather boots drawing a sharp line through the heavy silence. The veteran keeper of the deeper libraries cleared his throat, sensing the sudden wrongness in the atmosphere. "Your Grace?" Keith asked, his gruff voice threaded with caution. "Is there an error in the grain tallies?" Darius did not look up. He turned another page, his cracked knuckles whitening against the scarred oak of the table. November 3rd, the next page documented, the strokes of the pen cutting deeper into the fibrous paper. Requested a wool blanket from the domestic quartermaster. Request denied by Nellie Gray. Directed to transport the historical slate tablets from the lower vault to the 3rd floor registry. Darius's jaw tightened. The historical slate tablets were ancient, carved from solid rock, each weighing near 30 pounds. They were a burden meant for 2 strong guards, not a fragile Omega archivist. He read the next line, and the ambient temperature in the war room seemed to plummet instantly. November 4th, slate transport completed. 40 trips. Physical condition, fever recorded at 103 degrees. Weight loss for the month, 12 pounds. No medical supplies provided. Work continues. Darius stopped breathing. 12 pounds. A 103-degree fever. Carrying stone up 6 flights of stairs while burning alive with sickness, entirely unassisted. He stared at the number. It was a temperature that could kill a weakened Omega. And she had simply noted it, carried the heavy stones until her hands bled, and written work continues. The silence that descended upon the war room carried a physical weight, pressing against the stone walls until the air itself felt brittle. Darius remained physically static, his posture perfectly upright, his hands flat on either side of the bound pages, but the alpha aura bleeding from him was terrifying. It was a cold, suffocating pressure, flooding the chamber with absolute unyielding territorial fury. Keith took a slow, involuntary step back, his hand instinctively dropping to the hilt of his short sword. The air grew so violently cold that the veteran's next breath plumed white. On the desk, just inches from the logbook, sat a heavy glass inkwell. As Darius's silent rage peaked, a thin crystalline layer of frost began to skin over the surface of the black ink. The cold spiderwebbed across the glass, cracking faintly in the oppressive quiet. The hearth fire across the room did not go out, but its heat was entirely devoured by the sheer magnitude of the sovereign's atmospheric pressure. "My king," Keith murmured, fighting against the crushing weight of the aura. He did not know what was written in the cheap, pigskin ledger, but he knew Darius well enough to recognize the absolute stillness that preceded a public execution. Darius did not yell. He simply looked at the dry, grey ink that documented the quiet agony of the clerk, the meticulous records of a woman who had been starved, frozen, and broken under his own roof while keeping his estate running. He let that knowledge settle into him like cold water into stone, slow, thorough, filling every crack. The systemic cruelty of Alistair Thorne, the vindictive withholding by the domestic staff, it was all here, mathematically proven. They had treated her as less than nothing, and she had built a flawless legal case against them in the dark. Darius finally moved. He slowly closed the damning evidence, the sound of the cover shutting echoing like a gavel striking wood in the frozen chamber. The war room smelled of cedar and cold iron. Darius Vaughan did not sit. He stood by the long oak table, the frayed volume resting beneath his right hand. The heavy doors opened with a soft groan of hinges, allowing Nellie Gray to enter. Nellie was a domestic maid who thrived on the strict, rigid hierarchy of the fortress. She usually moved with the opportunistic confidence of someone who knew exactly who to step on to maintain her modest standing. Now, standing before the Alpha King, that confidence dissolved into a rigid, trembling posture. She smelled of stale flour, rendered tallow, and sharp, metallic fear. Darius let the quiet stretch until Nellie's gaze dropped to the stone floor. Her knuckles turned stark white where she gripped the coarse linen of her apron. "You manage the lower kitchen distributions," Darius said. His voice was a low, unhurried drawl that barely disturbed the air in the room, yet it commanded absolute attention. Nellie nodded once, a jerky, mechanical motion. "Yes, Your Grace." Darius opened the black leather cover of the logbook. The dry crackle of the binding sounded unnaturally loud. He did not look at her. "Tell me about the rations sent to the sub-basement archives over the last 3 months." The maid swallowed hard. She was terrified of Alistair Thorne's retribution, knowing that head seneschal controlled the daily lives of the staff, but the territorial pressure radiating from the sovereign was immediate and suffocating. She chose her words with evasive precision, retreating into the only safe language she knew. "The standard allocation is 16 ounces of milled rye per worker, Your Grace," Nellie whispered, keeping her eyes fixed on the hem of Darius's dark cloak. For the lower archives, the order came down to adjust the weight. 8 ounces by the end of harvest, cut to 4 ounces on the 10th of the frost month. Darius traced a line of Maron Vance's meticulous handwriting. The entry for the 10th read simply, "half ration, water mixed with grain dust." "And the meat provisions?" Darius asked, his tone remaining perfectly flat. "Diverted, Your Grace," Nellie answered, her breath hitching. She twisted the linen apron tighter around her fingers. "The ledger said bone broth for the lower clerks. We sent boiling water with onion skins, 2 ounces of rendered fat per week, then reduced to nothing by the first snow." She spoke entirely in weight measures, using the clinical math of the kitchen to distance herself from the reality of starvation. 3 ounces removed here, 4 ounces subtracted there. It was a quiet, daily conspiracy of neglect executed by compliant hands. Darius closed the black leather logbook. The soft thud echoed against the stone walls. He did not yell. He merely let that knowledge settle into him like cold water into stone. "Leave," Darius commanded softly. Nellie scrambled backward, bowing deeply before fleeing through the heavy doors, leaving the sovereign alone with the evidence. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing the war room in absolute quiet. Darius turned his attention back to the long table. He reached for the iron lockbox resting at the center, turning a heavy brass key to release the latch. Inside lay the official palace disbursement sheets, the very records his senior counsel presented to him every quarter. He pulled the heavy vellum stacks onto the polished wood. The royal ledger smelled of expensive wax seals, fresh parchment, and gold flake ink. It was the physical manifestation of the keep's wealth and systemic order. Darius placed the logbook directly beside the pristine treasury documents. The visual contrast was a physical blow. He aligned the ragged, ink-stained edges of the cheap pigskin paper with the thick, flawless vellum. He turned to the 12th day of November. In the royal ledger, Alistair's elegant, sweeping script recorded a requisition for the sub-basement archives. 50 copper coins allocated for winter firewood. 10 silver coins designated for seasonal medical supplies, specifically comfrey root and willow bark to prevent the winter damp from rotting the clerk's lungs. The column was marked as fulfilled and officially inspected. Darius moved his gaze to the cheap pigskin page. Maron's handwriting was small, precise, and entirely devoid of self-pity. He read the entry silently. November 12. Temperature in the lower vault dropped below freezing. Charcoal heater confiscated by head seneschal. No firewood delivered. Hands too stiff to bind the textile registry properly. Used breath to thaw fingers. The muscles along Darius's jaw tightened until the bone ached. He did not sweep the ledgers off the table. He did not shatter the glass lanterns lining the walls. Instead, his fury crystallized into a cold, methodical focus. He turned another page. December 4. Fever suspected, throat bleeding, requested willow bark from the upper infirmary, denied by domestic staff, required to carry 12 slate tablets to the 4th floor repository. He checked the Royal Ledger for December 4th. A massive surplus of medical funds had been quietly transferred into a secondary household account managed by the senior officers. The winter rations intended for the lowest-ranking Omega workers had been systematically sold back to the local merchants, the profits pocketed by the men Darius trusted to run his home. Every missing ounce of bread, every stolen piece of coal, every denied cup of medicine perfectly matched a fraudulent surplus entry in the royal vellum. Marin had not just recorded her own suffering. By logging the exact daily conditions of her survival with clinical precision, she had unknowingly created a flawless, chronological map of systemic embezzlement. Darius traced the edge of the frayed black leather. The cheap binding held the absolute truth of his court's corruption. His authority had been used as a shield by arrogant men who viewed invisible labor as something to be exploited. He carefully closed both books. The time for observation had ended. The evidence was secured. Darius gathered the official vellum and the ragged logbook, his posture straightening, as he prepared to weaponize administrative law against his own court. The king did not summon his royal guard. He did not issue immediate warrants for the arrest of the senior staff. Darius stepped out of the heated upper council chamber, carrying nothing but a heavy, silver wolfskin mantle draped over his left forearm. He bypassed the carpeted corridors of the residential wing, ignoring the questioning glances of the passing sentries, and turned toward the northern stairwell. The heavy oak door sealing the lower levels groaned as he pushed it open. Instantly, the ambient temperature plummeted. He began to descend. The first flight of stairs was polished marble, warmed by the ambient heat of the upper keep. The air here still carried the faint, sweet scent of pine oil and roasting venison from the kitchens. By the second flight, the marble gave way to chipped slate. The decorative wall tapestries vanished. The torches grew further apart, their flames flickering weakly against the rising draft. The warmth disappeared completely, replaced by a sharp, metallic current sweeping up from the deep foundations. Darius walked with a deliberate, terrifying quiet. His heavy leather boots made almost no sound against the stone. He was not merely walking, he was measuring the descent. He was auditing the physical environment. November 12th, a line from her neat handwriting echoed in his mind. The dampness reaches the 42nd step. The torches are no longer replaced past the second landing. Darius reached the 42nd step. He stopped. He dragged the fingertips of his glove along the granite wall. The stone was slick with moisture, a thin layer of freezing condensation clinging to the rock. The iron brackets bolted into the masonry ahead were empty, filled only with old cobwebs and rust. She had recorded the exact physical boundary of the keep's neglect. He continued downward. The air grew steadily heavier, stale and suffocatingly damp. The scent of pine oil faded entirely, swallowed by the odor of wet earth, rotting wood, and deep winter frost. By the 4th flight of stairs, the temperature dropped below freezing. His breath plumed white in the darkness. December 4th. The frost sets on the raw granite of the final corridor. It takes 3 layers of wool to prevent the joints from stiffening before midday. Darius reached the bottom of the stairwell. He stood at the entrance of the sub-basement corridor. The passage stretched out before him, a long, narrow tunnel carved directly into the bedrock of the mountain. There were no braziers. There were no carpets to insulate the floors. The only illumination came from a series of small iron-grated vents, set high near the ceiling, allowing a faint, grey twilight to filter down from the snow-covered courtyard above. The cold here was not merely weather. It was a physical weight, pressing against the lungs, biting into exposed skin with the sharpness of shattered glass. He stood perfectly still in the freezing dark. The sovereign let that knowledge settle into him like cold water into stone, slow, thorough, filling every crack. His senior officers had banished a member of his household to a space designed for storing root vegetables and forgotten iron. At the far end of the corridor, a single, guttering point of yellow light wavered in the gloom. Darius moved toward it. The heavy oak door to the archive room stood partially open, the wood swollen and warped from the constant dampness. He stopped just outside the threshold, letting the shadows conceal his massive frame. Maren sat at a splintering wooden table, surrounded by towering walls of neglected ledgers. She wore a threadbare grey dress. The fabric so worn it offered no real insulation against the freezing air. Over her shoulders she had draped a coarse packing blanket. She was not shivering. She had moved past the stage of shivering, her body locked into a rigid, energy-conserving stillness. She was mending a heavy property registry. Darius watched her hands. Her knuckles were split, the skin raw and red from the relentless cold. As she pushed a thick bone needle through the stiff parchment, the movement pulled the cracked skin of her index finger apart. A fresh drop of dark blood welled up, smearing against the edge of the page. She did not pause. She did not wipe it away. She simply adjusted her grip, keeping the blood strictly away from the ink, and pulled the coarse linen thread taut. The only heat source in the cavernous room was a single cheap tallow candle melting down into a rusted tin plate. It cast long, erratic shadows against her pale face, highlighting the sharp hollows of her cheeks where the 12 pounds of lost weight had vanished. Darius shifted his weight. His boot scraped faintly against the loose gravel on the stone floor. The reaction was instantaneous. Maren did not gasp. She did not drop her needle. She did not spin around to see who was standing in the darkness. She simply leaned forward and blew out the candle. The flame died with a quiet hiss. The room was immediately swallowed by near-total blackness, leaving only the weak ambient light bleeding through the high vent. The acrid scent of extinguished animal fat drifted through the freezing air. Darius stopped breathing. The utter pragmatism of the gesture lodged in his chest like a sliver of cold glass. She had heard a potential threat in the dark, and her very first instinct was not to seek help, not to defend herself, but to save the remaining half-inch of wax. It was a calculated survival mechanic. She valued the resource more than her own visibility. Silence fell over the archive. Not the kind of silence that falls between words. The kind that swallows them whole. Maren sat perfectly still in the dark, her spine straight, waiting for the intruder to declare their business. She listened to the air pressure shift in the doorway. The presence standing there did not move like a seneschal. It did not carry the nervous, heavy-footed arrogance of Alistair. The shadow blocking the corridor was massive, occupying the space without apology, radiating a wave of latent, terrifying heat that pushed back the chill of the room. Darius stepped fully over the threshold. The faint, greyed light from the high grate caught the broad lines of his shoulders. It illuminated the heavy threads woven into the silver wolfskin mantle draped over his arm. The king did not speak immediately. He looked at the smoking wick of the tallow candle. Then he looked at the fresh blood slowly drying on her cracked knuckles. Maren's breath caught in her throat. Her hands finally stilled over the open registry. The air in the subterranean vault did not warm gradually. It shifted in a sudden, massive displacement as Darius Vaughan unfastened the heavy iron clasp at his throat. The fabric swept through the freezing dark, carrying the sharp, clean scent of crushed pine and winter ozone. Maren barely registered the motion before a crushing weight of heat settled over her thin shoulders. It was the king's silver wolfskin mantle. The garment was lined with dense, heat-retaining fur and interwoven with thick, metallic threads that caught the meager, guttering candlelight. It did not just block the draught, it obliterated it. The ambient heat radiated outward from the heavy lining, seeping into muscles that had been locked in a rigid, shivering cage for 3 unbroken weeks. Maren remained perfectly still. She did not gasp or pull away. She had spent enough of her life learning not to react to sudden movements from authority, recognizing that complete stillness was often the only reliable defense against further punishment. But this motion was not a threat. It was an absolute, physical barricade against the cold. She felt the automatic instinct to pull the edges of the mantle closer, to secure the impossible warmth against her threadbare linen dress. Her hands twitched upward. Her fingers were raw. The skin split deep across the knuckles, and weeping clear fluid from the relentless frost of the unheated records room. Before she could close her damaged hands around the silver trim, the sovereign shifted his stance. He did not grab her wrists. He did not issue a sharp command to hold still. Instead, he reached past her shaking hands and gathered the thick, insulated folds of the cloak himself. He moved with the slow, deliberate calculation of a man dismantling a rusted snare. His bare hands carefully avoided touching her cracked, bleeding fingertips. He gripped only the heavy wool and fur, lifting the edges of the mantle and folding them securely across her chest. He deliberately shielded her damaged skin from the coarse friction of the fabric, ensuring that his own hands held the garment closed, so her raw knuckles did not have to bear the tension. It was a profound, paralyzing kind of carefulness. Maren was accustomed to the careless shoves of the domestic staff, to Alistair Thorne kicking a stack of slates across the floor and demanding she gather them with bleeding palms. She understood systemic cruelty perfectly. It possessed a mathematical predictability. This precise, measured gentleness from the Alpha King was entirely alien. It required a level of microscopic observation that no one in the royal household had ever directed at her. Darius pulled the heavy collar higher, insulating her neck from the damp subterranean draft, his actions dictated entirely by the map of injuries he refused to aggravate. Darius did not ask for permission to lift her, but he telegraphed the movement, giving her a long, silent second to brace herself before he moved. He slid one arm beneath her knees and the other across her back, keeping the heavy layers of the luxurious garment between his armor and her bruised ribs. When he stood, the sudden change in elevation made the damp archive spin dizzily around her. She weighed almost nothing. The 12 pounds she had lost over the last month made her dangerously light, a fact that seemed to harden the sharp, rigid line of the king's jaw as he adjusted his hold. He turned and carried her out of the sub-basement. They ascended the narrow, spiraling stone steps that separated the forgotten lower depths from the active administrative levels. As they breached the heavy iron door of the main corridor, the environment shifted violently. The absolute darkness of the archives was replaced by the harsh, burning glare of oil torches mounted along the polished granite walls. There were 4 royal guards stationed at the intersection of the primary hallway. They straightened instantly, their armor clattering as they snapped to attention at the sight of their ruler. Their eyes widened, tracking the massive, silver-lined bundle carried tightly against the king's chest. They expected a command. They expected an explanation for why the sovereign had descended into the servants' quarters and returned carrying a woman wrapped in his personal colours. Darius offered none. He did not pause, nor did he issue a single loud declaration of his authority. He simply walked through them, claiming the space with a cold, terrifying momentum that forced the seasoned guards to step back and press their shoulders against the stone walls in absolute, confused silence. Maren did not look at them. The sudden intrusion of light and the terrifying exposure of the upper corridors sent a spike of pure, survival-driven panic through her chest. Instead of shrinking away, she turned her head inward and buried her face deep into the thick, heated folds of the silver wolfskin mantle. She closed her eyes, hiding her identity from the torchlight and the stunned, whispering sentries. The heavy scent of pine and cedar acted as a physical barrier against the overwhelming sensory assault of the keep. She remained completely silent, her breathing shallow, letting the rhythmic, unhurried thud of the king's boots on the stone floor serve as the only anchor in a world that had suddenly inverted. He carried her past the administrative wing, bypassing the crowded lower infirmary entirely, and began the long, steady ascent toward the restricted, heavily guarded doors of his personal royal chambers. The ambient heat of the royal chambers struck Marin with the physical force of a falling stone. It was a thick, even warmth radiating from a massive hearth built of black and slynut. The contrast was almost violent. Down in the subterranean archives, the cold had been a living entity, creeping under her thin woolen dress and settling deep into her marrow. Here the air smelled faintly of cedar resin and wood smoke, rich and heavy. Her muscles, locked into a state of defensive tension for 3 long winters, began to throb as they slowly unspooled. She remained perfectly still on the velvet-upholstered settee, buried inside the heavy metallic threaded fur. The thick fur lined with metallic threads weighed down her frail shoulders, acting as a physical anchor that kept her from trembling as her core temperature began its slow climb toward normal. She kept her hands perfectly still beneath the heavy folds, hiding the cracked, bleeding skin of her knuckles from the pristine luxury of the room. Darius did not ring for the domestic staff. The silence of the cedar-paneled room remained absolute, save for the crackling pine logs. Marin watched him move through the space with the clinical detachment of a clerk observing an irregular ledger entry. He was the sovereign. His rank dictated that he should snap his fingers and have a dozen Omegas scurrying to attend him. Instead, the Alpha King walked directly to the hearth, took a heavy iron kettle from a hook, and poured a steaming measure of venison broth into a deep ceramic bowl. The rich, savory scent of roasted meat and root vegetables hit her senses, sharp enough to make her stomach cramp. It had been nearly a month since Nellie Gray had allowed her anything more than watery gruel, actively withholding rations to force her compliance. When Darius turned back toward her, Marin's breath hitched. She forced her chin to remain level, locking her expression into a polite mask, but Darius did not crowd her. He stopped precisely 2 paces away from the settee, meticulously placing the steaming bowl and a linen napkin on a low oak table directly within her reach. Then, he deliberately stepped back. He did not loom over her to demand she eat. He took 3 measured steps backward until his broad shoulders rested against the far stone pillar of the fireplace, putting the entire width of the hearth between them. He crossed his arms and lowered his gaze to the logs. It was a conscious, tactical mitigation of his own terrifying territorial presence. Darius understood that a worker conditioned by systemic abuse would only view a towering alpha as a threat. By surrendering the immediate ground, he was handing her absolute control over her own physical perimeter. Marin let that knowledge settle into her like cold water into stone. He was giving her permission to exist in the space without having to earn it through obedience. Carefully, she uncurled one ink-stained hand from beneath the silver trim. Her knuckles were raw, the joints stiff with lingering frost, but she managed to close her fingers around the ceramic bowl. The warmth of the baked clay seeped into her palms. She lifted the rim and drank. The broth was heavily spiced and hot enough to sting her throat, but it anchored her frayed nerves. She drank methodically, her eyes never leaving the powerful man who had chosen to occupy the farthest edge of his own room, just so she could feel safe. The silence stretched, comfortable and measured, until the bowl was empty. Marin set the clay vessel back onto the oak table. Only then did Darius shift his stance. He pushed off the stone pillar, moved toward a heavy mahogany desk near the frost-covered windows, and picked up an object. He walked back toward the hearth, stopping exactly at the invisible boundary line he had established earlier. In his scarred hand, he held her black leather logbook. Marin stared at the familiar black leather cover. Her spine stiffened instinctively. That book was not a diary of private laments. It was a factual, chronological record of every stolen ration and every violation of administrative law committed by the head seneschal. She had bound the pages herself, using a rusted awl and leftover hemp thread, hiding it beneath the loose floorboards of the archive whenever Alistair Thorne made his rounds. If the wrong person had found it, the punishment for documenting the court's corruption would have been severe. Yet, held in the king's steady grip, the ledger did not look like contraband. It looked like an indictment. "Your entries," Darius began, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "They are flawless, the dates, the exact measures of firewood withheld, the ambient temperatures recorded during your shifts. You mapped the theft of the estate's treasury by documenting the exact margin of your own starvation. You tracked the missing coal against the funds allocated by the royal treasury." He stepped half a pace forward, offering the book to her. He did not offer pity. He offered professional validation. "I promise you, Marin Vance, your work will never be ignored in this keep again." Marin slowly extended her hand from the folds of the mantle. She did not take the book back. Instead, she gently rested her raw fingertips against the worn leather cover. Her thumb drifted to the bottom right corner, finding a faint, discolored smudge pressed deep into the grain. It was a grease stain she had made months ago, on a Tuesday when Alistair had ordered her to inventory the kitchen's tallow reserves, but explicitly denied her the soap to wash her hands afterward. She did not ask if the seneschal would be punished. Her mind operated on the strict logical metrics of a clerk. "The structural integrity of a ledger relies on unbroken continuity," Marin said, her voice raspy but perfectly steady. She met the sovereign's intense, storm-dark gaze. "I only had access to the subterranean inventory figures. I could not verify the royal disbursed sheets to prove the missing funds were pocketed. If you cross-reference page 42 with the winter tax registry, you will find a discrepancy of 400 gold pieces in the heating budget alone. Was my recorded data accurate enough to be useful to you, Your Grace?" Darius occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. He looked down at her small, battered hand, resting on the damning evidence of his court's rot. He saw the grease stain. He saw the split skin of her cuticles. The corner of his jaw tightened, betraying the immense cold fury simmering beneath his restrained exterior. He did not growl. He did not pace. His anger was a frozen, calculating thing, directed entirely outward toward the men who had treated her as less than human. "It was more than useful, Marin," Darius answered quietly, his tone carrying the weight of a final verdict. "It is the exact rope they will use to hang themselves." He pulled the ledger back, holding it with the careful reverence usually reserved for royal blood treaties. "You have provided the irrefutable evidence. Tomorrow, I will convene the entire household in the great hall. We will read this ledger aloud to Alistair Thorne." The fire popped, a loud crack in the heavy silence. "Rest now. The architecture of their ruin is complete." The heavy iron clock in the corridor chimed the half-hour, its resonance vibrating through the cold stone of the keep like a heartbeat. Keith Sterling stood before the massive oak desk in the king's private study, his ink-stained fingers resting loosely against the seams of his practical wool trousers. The room smelled of burning pine and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone that always accompanied the sovereign's quiet fury. Darius Vaughan did not pace the length of the room. He sat perfectly still, his large hands resting flat on the polished wood, flanking the worn edges of Maren's handmade register. The king's voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, measured drawl that carried the absolute weight of a falling blade. He instructed the older archivist to descend immediately to the sub-basement levels and secure every ledger room, every inventory vault, and every administrative door within the lower keep. No one was to enter or leave the records chambers. Not the guards, not the domestic staff, and under no circumstances the head seneschal. Keith did not ask for a justification, nor did he offer empty reassurances. He had served in the deeper libraries long enough to recognize the particular stillness of a predator waiting for the trap to snap shut. The archivist merely nodded, collecting the heavy ring of master keys from the iron hook by the door. The king was not ordering a physical arrest, but a bureaucratic suffocation. It was a siege executed not with drawn steel or violent threats, but with sealing wax, strict access registries, and the quiet turning of tumblers in the dark. The descent into the lower corridors was solitary and methodical. The ambient temperature dropped with every flight of stone stairs, the air growing damp and thick with the familiar scent of old parchment and cold dust. Keith moved through the dim passages with practiced efficiency, sliding heavy iron keys into ancient locks, sealing the heavy timber doors that guarded the keep's financial history. At the final threshold of the primary ledger room, where Maron had suffered in freezing silence, for so long he pulled a stick of red resin from his pocket. He held it to the flame of his lantern until it softened, letting the thick, dark drops fall across the iron lock and the wood of the door frame. He pressed his personal brass seal deep into the hot wax, holding it there until the material hardened into an unbreakable bond. Stepping back, Keith stared at the unbroken seal in the dim light. He understood the architecture of the sovereign's command perfectly. This was not merely about preserving documents or protecting the archives from dust. It was about severing the lifeline of the corrupt officials who relied on altering those texts to hide their systematic theft. The king was locking the beast in a cage of its own making. Cutting off Alistair's ability to destroy the evidence of his long-standing fraud before the Great Reckoning, Keith slipped the brass stamp back into his pocket, his blunt features settling into a grim line. The silent war had begun, and the battlefield was built entirely of paper, ink, and denied access. Less than an hour later, the sharp, authoritative click of expensive leather boots echoed down the damp stone corridor. Alistair Thorne arrived at the archive, landing with the brisk, entitled stride of a man who believed the keep existed solely to serve his convenience and line his pockets. He wore a tailored coat of dark velvet, perfectly pristine against the gloom of the lower levels, his silver senescal chain catching the weak light of the wall sconces. He expected to find the heavy doors propped open, ready for his routine manipulation of the quarterly grain audits before the council convened. Instead, he found his path blocked by two royal guards wielding iron-tipped halberds, their expressions entirely devoid of sympathy or deference. Alistair halted, a flicker of genuine irritation breaking through his performative politeness. He adjusted the pristine cuffs of his shirt, offering the guards a smooth, condescending smile that did not reach his cold eyes. He informed them that there had been a miscommunication, that he was the head seneschal of the estate, and that his administrative duties required immediate access to the ledger room. The guards did not speak, nor did they shift their halberds an inch to accommodate his status. Their silence was absolute, rooted in sovereign orders that far exceeded the authority of any household manager or corrupt official. From the shadows of the adjacent passageway, Keith Sterling stepped into the lantern light, a minor tax ledger tucked casually under his arm. Alistair's rigid posture relaxed, marginally at the sight of the familiar archivist, though his smile grew sharper, carrying the distinct edge of a hierarchical demand. He approached Keith with the smooth confidence of a predator, accustomed to hunting in bureaucratic waters, assuming the older man could be easily swayed. Reaching into the inner pocket of his velvet coat, Alistair produced a small, leather-bound pouch of imported southern tobacco. He held it out with a practiced casualness, framing the gesture as a friendly exchange between colleagues rather than the blatant, desperate bribe it truly was. He suggested, in a low, conspiratorial tone, that the archivist could easily break the wax seal for just a few moments to allow a superior officer inside. It was a minor inconvenience, Alistair insisted, just a quick verification of a textile receipt that needed his signature before the afternoon council meeting. He had no idea that the foundation of his authority was crumbling. Keith looked at the offered pouch, his expression remaining profoundly unimpressed and thoroughly grounded in reality. The older man did not reach for the bribe, nor did he offer a polite, deferential excuse for the delay. He simply stated that the seal was royal, the lock was secured by the king's explicit command, and the doors would remain closed until Darius himself demanded they be opened. The archivist's dry, realistic tone left no room for negotiation, stripping away the seneschal's illusion of control in one swift motion. Alistair's hand slowly dropped to his side, the pouch of tobacco vanishing back into his velvet coat. The arrogant certainty in his chest began to fracture, replaced by a cold, creeping dread that the impenetrable hierarchy he had exploited for years was shifting beneath his feet. By the following morning, the great hall of the Northern Keep, a vast chamber designed for tribunals, its vaulted ceilings vanishing into cold shadows, was packed. The heavy oak doors swung shut, trapping the nervous breath of 60 domestic servants and estate managers. They had been summoned without a stated agenda. Alistair Thorne stood near the front, his posture impeccable, his woolen tunic brushed free of lint. He held his chin high, forcing serene authority over his lingering unease. He had convinced himself this gathering was a royal commendation. The king had locked down the archives, after all. To a man who viewed his corruption as brilliance, it was logical that the sovereign intended to praise his management. Alistair expected Darius to announce a wider audit under his direct supervision. He clasped his hands, waiting for his due praise. Near the iron braziers at the rear, Nellie Gray stood wedged between the scullery maids. She did not share the seneschal's confident posture. The ambient temperature was perfectly warm, radiating from glowing coals, but her hands were clammy. She twisted the rough linen of her apron, her eyes darting toward the raised stone dais. She was accustomed to reading the keep's mood, and today the geometry felt entirely wrong. The sovereign guards were not standing in ceremonial ease. Their hands rested deliberately near the hilts of their weapons, eyes locked on the exits. When Darius entered the hall, the low murmurs of the assembly extinguished instantly. The Alpha King did not stride to the center like a man handing out promotions. He walked with the measured, terrifying stillness of a predator calculating a strike. He took his place at the center of the dais, refusing the heavy oak throne. Instead, he stood behind the long mahogany viewing table, holding the quiet of the room without the slightest urge to fill it. He carried nothing but a single object in his scarred right hand. He set it down on the polished wood. From her obscured position at the back, Nellie stared at the object. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the black leather logbook. Even from 50 feet away, she recognized the black leather cover, the frayed grey thread, and the battered corners that had rested on the freezing archive tables for years. She had mocked the woman who wrote in it. Now, it sat under the amber light of the royal dais, directly beneath the king's fingers. A nauseating dread settled into her stomach like freezing rain. Darius did not shout. He did not issue a command for attention, because silence had already swallowed every trace of ambient noise. The entire hall oriented toward him, pulled by the gravity of his restraint. He opened the cheap cover. The sound of the stiff parchment turning echoed off the stone walls with the sharpness of a whip. He did not look at Alistair. November the 4th, Darius read. His voice was a low, flat baritone that carried flawlessly across the vast space. It was the cadence of a magistrate delivering a sentence. Archive temperature recorded at 29 degrees. Daily charcoal ration requisitioned by Head Seneschal Thorne for upper-level guest suites. No replacement fuel provided. 3 fingers split from frost exposure while binding the textile registry. Alistair's smile faltered. His face twitched as if struck by an invisible weight. He blinked, shifting his stance uneasily. his eyes darting toward the dacers. That was not a commendation. That was a direct clinical quote from a ledger he did not recognize, read with a chilling lack of inflection. Darius turned another page of the black leather logbook, the sound cutting off the seneschal's breath. November the 12th. Severe fever setting in, requisition for standard willow bark tea and warm broth denied by the kitchen staff. Carried 40 slate tablets to the upper repository. Weight loss this month documented at 12 pounds. The king paused, letting the silence press down on the room. He reached beside the logbook and pulled a pristine volume forward. It was the official estate disbursement ledger, the very book Alistair had curated. Darius opened it with deliberate precision. Official ledger entry, November the 12th, Darius continued, maintaining his devastating tone. 80 copper pieces allocated for winter medicinal supplies to the lower archives. 3 cords of premium pine wood documented as delivered to the sub-basement. Daily hot meal rations marked as fulfilled. He closed the official ledger. The heavy thud of the cover sounded like dirt hitting a coffin. He slowly looked up, his pale gaze cutting through the crowd and finding Alistair in the exact center of the room. The funds were drawn, Darius said, the temperature in his voice dropping below freezing. The wood was signed for. The food was recorded as eaten. And yet, the clerk who maintains the textile records was starving in the dark, bleeding onto the parchment to keep this estate running. Alistair opened his mouth, a reflexive defense rising to his lips. He attempted to summon his performative politeness, ready to claim that Omega workers were prone to exaggeration. But Darius simply turned another page, the sound cutting off the seneschal's excuses. December the 1st, the king read, his eyes returning to the meticulous handwriting of the woman currently resting in his private quarters. Requested a single candle to replace the stolen tallow. Request mocked and denied. Filed the eastern boundary tax reports by the light of the corridor grate. Every date was a hammer blow. Every precise temperature recording and missing ration dismantled the intricate web of systemic cruelty Alistair had built. Darius did not need to raise his voice to assert dominance. He simply used the neglected clerk's undeniable records to systematically destroy the seneschal's authority. The facts were an iron cage, and the king was locking the door. The great hall's silence held, thick and suffocating. Alistair Thorne, standing at the center of the polished stone floor, stared up at the king. His performative politeness began to crack under the immense atmospheric pressure of the room. The head seneschal gestured sharply toward the meticulous diary resting in the sovereign's hand, his expression twisting into a mask of frantic indignance. "My king!" "This is madness," Alistair said, his voice echoing too loudly against the high vault of the ceiling. He took half a step forward before the flanking guards stiffened. "You are condemning your senior staff based on the scribblings of an unranked Omega. Marin is an unreliable liar, a bitter clerk who lacked the discipline for high office. Her mind is clearly addled by the freezing damp of the cellar." Darius Vaughan did not raise his voice. He simply held the cheap pigskin binding, his thumb tracing the worn edge. "You claim her records are false," the Alpha King said, his tone dangerously measured. "Entirely fabricated, sire," Alistair insisted. He pointed a trembling finger directly at the open pages. "Look at it. There is even a smudge there, right on the entry for November 12th. A careless, frantic smudge of cheap ink. That alone proves she was forging the numbers in a panic, trying to cover her incompetence. It invalidates the entire 3-year record. A true archivist would never stain a royal ledger." Darius looked down at the tiny imperfection of ink. It was not a forged error. It was a smear of iron gall ink mixed with copper blood, the exact place where a freezing, cracked finger had pressed too hard against the parchment while trying to hold the book steady in an unheated room. The sovereign slowly closed the black leather logbook. He placed it carefully on the dark mahogany table beside him, then gave a single nod to Keith Sterling. The pragmatic archivist stepped forward from the shadows, carrying a heavy wooden crate bound in rusted iron. He dropped it onto the floor between the king and the seneschal. Keith kicked the lid open with his boot, revealing hundreds of yellowed parchment sheets bound in official red wax seals. "These," Darius said, his voice dropping into a low register that made the ambient temperature seem to plummet, "are the official regional disbursement sheets. The delivery logs for firewood, textile imports, and grain supplies. The ones you signed, Thorne." Keith pulled a thick sheaf of papers from the top of the crate. "Delivery logs for November 12th, he stated bluntly, reading the crisp text, signed by the head seneschal, authorizing 3 cords of dry pine wood, 20 pounds of salted meat, and heavy woolen blankets for the lower archive staff. The funds were drawn from the royal treasury on that exact date," Darius continued, his gaze pinning Alistair to the spot. "The gold left the vault. The provisions were marked as having left the storehouse. And yet, Maren's D-log proves the basement temperature remained exactly at freezing, and her rations were cut entirely. The gold never bought wood. The wood never reached the cellar. So tell me, where is the coin, Alistair?" The arrogant seneschal's face drained of all colour, turning a sickly grey. His mouth opened, but only a dry, rattling breath escaped his throat. He looked at the crate of pristine, forged delivery logs, and then up at the king's passive face. The smudge on Maren's page had not been the sign of a liar. It was the only honest mark in a mountain of systemic fraud. Alistair's knees gave way slightly, his rigid posture collapsing under the realization that his intricate system of theft had been completely dismantled. Darius stepped down from the dais. His movements were slow, unhurried, and perfectly controlled. The sovereign walked across the stone floor until he was standing a few feet from the trembling seneschal, occupying the space with absolute authority. "You used your administrative authority to strip a loyal worker of her dignity, her warmth, and her food," Darius said softly, the quiet words carrying far more threat than a shout. "You forged the sacred seal of this house to steal from its foundation, while the person who actually kept this estate running bled onto her ledgers." Alistair swallowed hard, his hands shaking violently as he stared at the dark velvet hem of the king's cloak. Behind him, the other complicit staff members shrank back into the cold shadows, their faces pale with terror. "You are no longer the head seneschal of the Northern Keep," Darius declared, his tone clinically precise. "You are formally stripped of your title. You are stripped of your assets, your quarters, and your rank within this pack. Every ounce of gold you embezzled will be seized from your semicentral vaults and returned to the treasury." The king turned his head slightly, nodding to the archivist standing near the crate of evidence. "Remove his access." Keith did not hesitate. He walked toward the fallen seneschal, his expression devoid of sympathy. Alistair tried to instinctively protect his waist, his hands hovering over the heavy leather key loop fastened to his formal uniform belt. It was the ultimate symbol of his control over the estate's locked doors and secure vaults. "Keith, please," Alistair whispered, his voice cracking with genuine panic. "I am a senior officer. You cannot do this in front of the court." The older man drew his ceremonial steel dagger from his side. He did not ask for permission, nor did he fumble with the intricate brass buckles. With a swift, sharp downward motion, the archivist sliced directly through the thick leather strap of Alistair's uniform. The heavy iron ring broke free. It held the massive brass key to the grain silos, the long iron key to the subterranean archives, and the polished silver keys to the upper halls. It hit the polished granite floor with a loud, violent clatter that echoed off the high-vaulted ceiling. The sound of heavy metal striking stone was sharp, jarring, and definitive, marking the exact physical moment a corrupt reign ended. The keys lay there, discarded in the dust like absolute garbage. Alistair stared down at the severed leather hanging uselessly from his waist, the reality of his complete irreversible ruin finally settling into his bones. Darius looked down at the shattered man, his expression as cold and unforgiving as the northern winter wind. "Gather the others." The Alpha King commanded the royal guards, his voice cutting cleanly through the remaining tension in the room. "The verdict is recorded. The sentence is final." The king's voice did not rise. Darius Vaughan looked down at the former head seneschal, his gaze empty of rage but heavy with absolute territorial finality. "The Northern Keep operates on equivalent exchange," the sovereign stated. "A ledger must balance. You have withdrawn 3 years of heat, sustenance, and dignity from this estate's foundation. Now you will repay the deficit." Alistair stood frozen. He opened his mouth to cite ancient pack laws, but the crushing weight of the Alpha's presence pinned the air in his lungs. Beside him, the complicit managers stared at the stone floor in panic. "You are hereby sentenced to the outer perimeter," Darius continued, his tone undeniable as a slate tablet. "You will clear the frozen drainage ditches under the exact conditions recorded in the clerk's hand-made ledger. There will be no charcoal braziers, no supplementary firewood. You will carry the frozen mud and stone by hand until the boundary is fully restored." The sentence settled over the room like a dropping winter temperature. Alistair Thorne would endure the exact deprivation he had signed off on. "Guards," the sovereign instructed softly. "Prepare them for the workhouse." 2 armoured sentries stepped forward, seizing the former seneschal by the shoulders. Alistair did not fight, his legs losing their structural support. Before they could drag him toward the courtyard, the king raised a gloved hand. "The coat," Darius said. Alistair blinked, his breath hitching. He looked down at his magnificent coat, lined with thick bare fur, a garment purchased with embezzled treasury funds. The temperature in the subterranean archives was recorded at 5 degrees below freezing on the 12th of November, Darius observed, his voice devoid of sympathy. "An Omega does not require warmth to fulfill their duties. That was your official ruling. Take it off." For a long moment, only the howling northern wind rattled the high windows. Alistair's hands shook violently as he fumbled with the cold metal clasps. One by one, he undid the fastenings and peeled the thick fur from his shoulders, the loss of insulation immediate and severe. When the fur hit the stone floor, the sound was a dull thud. Alistair stood in nothing but a thin linen undershirt. The draft hit him instantly, his teeth beginning to chatter. He was left shivering in the center of the hall, stripped completely of the institutional hierarchy that had insulated him. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the great hall swung inward, their massive iron hinges groaning. The remaining domestic staff turned in unison. Maren Vance stepped over the threshold. She did not walk with the hurried shuffle of a subterranean clerk. Her posture was straight, anchored by the immense weight of the sovereign's personal silver wolf-skin mantle. The heavy fur trailed against the stone, the metallic threads catching the amber light. It radiated a deep heat, a physical barrier against the biting draught tormenting the shivering prisoners. The hall fell into a profound silence. The estate's power dynamic had fundamentally reset itself around her. She did not look at Alistair or the disgraced officers. Her attention remained analytical, cataloguing the geometry of the room and the shifting loyalties of the staff. Darius stepped down from the dais. His movements were unhurried as he crossed the expanse of the hall, stopping a deliberate distance from Maren to leave a respectful boundary. He offered his hand, palm up, an invitation rather than a royal directive. Maren looked at his outstretched fingers. The contrast was stark, his hand scarred by territorial battles, hers still wrapped in clean linen bandages where the cold had split her knuckles. She reached out and rested her hand lightly over his. The king's dangerous edge smoothed into quiet guardianship as he guided her forward. The remaining workers watched with careful eyes, understanding the visual language of the court. The clerk was no longer a target. She was the absolute center of the sovereign's protective radius. From the assembled domestic line, a single figure broke rank. Nellie Gray took a cautious step forward, The royal guards tightened their grips on their polearms, anticipating a threat. Darius's gaze snapped toward her, a cold warning flaring in his posture. But Marin did not flinch. Nellie was an opportunistic survivor who had taken active pleasure in denying Marin her daily soup. Now the hierarchy had shifted, and the maid was pivoting with quiet compliance. Nellie stopped 3 paces away, her shoulders curled inward. Reaching into the deep pocket of her apron, she pulled out a small, faded object. It was a neatly folded wool shawl. Marin gently withdrew her hand from the king's hold. She stepped forward and accepted the mended wool. The fabric smelled faintly of wood smoke and dried lavender, a scent that anchored her to the quiet resilience of her own survival. She clutched the shawl against the silver wolfskin mantle, offering Nellie a slow, measured nod. The maid exhaled a shaky breath and stepped backward into the line. No words were spoken, because none were required. The corrupted hierarchy of the keep had been broken, replaced by a quiet, irrefutable dignity. Once the condemned staff were marched away to the frozen ditches, the great hall swiftly emptied of spectators. The heavy iron-bound doors closed with a solid, echoing thud that signaled the end of a corrupt era. The atmosphere in the vast chamber had fundamentally shifted. The suffocating weight of performative hierarchy and systemic cruelty had been surgically excised, leaving behind the sharp scent of pine needles, ozone, and cold winter air slipping through the high glass windows. The heavy silver wolfskin mantle, draped securely across her shoulders, provided a steady, radiating heat that seeped deep into her weary bones, slowly replacing the chill of the subterranean vaults. Darius stepped down from the raised stone platform. His movements were characteristically unhurried, lacking the aggressive, posturing swagger of a typical pack alpha asserting raw dominance. He moved like a sovereign who had just restored mathematical and moral equilibrium to his territory. The king gestured toward a designated space just to the right of the throne, a position traditionally reserved for the highest-ranking elders of the Legislative Council. There, a heavy, newly commissioned piece of furniture had been brought in and assembled by the royal craftsman. It was a wide, impeccably constructed mahogany desk, its expansive surface polished to a high glass-like sheen. The dark wood carried the rich, clean olfactory notes of beeswax, lemon oil, and aged cedar, completely absent of the damp rot that had characterized her previous workspace. The Treasury requires a mind that genuinely understands the true cost of every single copper penny, Darius said. His voice carried across the empty stone hall, entirely devoid of decorative flattery. He spoke with the absolute pragmatism of a ruler assigning a critical administrative task. It requires an auditor who knows the exact physical weight of a firewood ration and the precise, devastating consequence when that ration is maliciously denied. Therefore, by sovereign decree, this station belongs to you. He paused, looking down at the young woman who had endured his keep's darkest corners without ever losing her meticulous integrity. Marin, you are hereby appointed the Grand Justiciar of the Sovereign Treasury. No financial disbursement will leave this fortress without your official seal. No domestic seneschal will ever hold authority over your ledgers again. Marin stepped forward, her soft leather slippers making absolutely no sound against the flagstones. She extended a hand, her knuckles still pink, cracked and healing from the severe frostbite. Gently, she pressed her fingertips against the highly polished wood of her new desk. She traced the smooth, beveled edge, marveling at the pristine surface. For 3 years, her hands had been permanently stained, with cheap soot and inferior ink. Now she noticed with a strange, quiet realization that her fingers no longer left dark charcoal smudges on the wood. The desk remained immaculate. The appointment was not an act of royal pity, nor was it a romantic gesture designed to claim a vulnerable mate. It was a formal, structural acknowledgement of her undeniable technical competence. Darius had not gifted her power. He had simply recognized the authority she had already forged in the dark. The black leather logbook looked entirely out of place in the grand, opulent architecture of the throne room. Its black leather cover was warped from basement dampness, the corners frayed and splitting, the spine permanently cracked from being held in shivering hands. Yet, as Marin placed it squarely in the exact center of the mahogany desk, it commanded the immense space with the absolute gravity of foundational law. Darius Vaughan stood silently beside her, watching intently as she aligned the worn spine parallel to the edge of the wood. The sovereign did not crowd her personal space, nor did he attempt to dictate how she arranged her administrative tools. He occupied the silence with deep, respectful attention, allowing her the freedom to establish the geometry of her new jurisdiction. This desk, positioned directly adjacent to his own seat of territorial power, would now dictate the economic and ethical survival of the keep. The battered ledger was no longer a secret, desperate record of suffering. It was the active, binding constitution of the royal household. The young clerk ran her thumb over the uneven grey stitching of the cover. The movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely calm. She did not cry, because she had learned long ago that tears were a useless waste of moisture in a hostile climate. Instead, she let the deep, durable safety of the room settle into her chest like a stone dropping through still water. Slow, thorough, filling every crack. The stone walls around them were massively thick, completely blocking out the howling northern wind. The heavy velvet tapestries absorbed the ambient cold, and the air was rich with the comforting smell of burning hearth fires and dry parchment. Darius stepped slightly closer, reaching into the deep inner folds of his dark coat. He withdrew a small, heavy brass object and set it gently on the desk, placing it right next to the battered edge of her ledger. It was a solid brass candle holder, freshly lit, its wick thick and saturated with high-quality smokeless tallow. The flame burned bright, tall and steady, casting a warm, golden glow across the frayed binding and the ink-stained pages of her book. The light reflected off the polished mahogany, illuminating the exact spot where she would execute her daily work. "For your records," Darius murmured, his voice dropping to a low cadence that carried no command, only a profound, unbreakable promise of protection. "So you never have to strain your eyes in the dark again." Marin looked at the flame, feeling its gentle, consistent heat radiating against her pale cheek. She did not need to speak. The contract between them had been written not in blood, brute force, or magical decrees, but in the precise, undeniable accounting of truth. She pulled out the high-backed wooden chair, sat down, and opened the black leather logbook to a fresh, beautifully blank page. Tomorrow she would write a new law. Tonight, there was only the steady light, the scent of beeswax, and the quiet, undeniable certainty of a safe, permanent home.